when we look at the last few quarters of data, what we saw is that over, Q2 to June, we had 108,000 extra people employed in our economy. When we go June to September, that slowed to 72,000. And then we went September to December, that slowed, including this December data, to around 50,000. So the fall in the monthly data itself is not as concerning. But when we think about the slowing down of employment growth during this very high population growth period, we can see that the labour market is loosening. And for the RBA, that's probably a good thing. They're looking at this going, okay, there are more people here now who are going to be a little bit more careful about how they're spending their money, which means businesses have to be more careful about their prices, and that's really good for getting inflation down. In particular, we saw a huge increase in part-time employment over the month and a huge decrease in full-time employment. So it's not just about how many people lost or gained jobs, it's also about the kinds of jobs that we're seeing coming into the economy. Being more part-time, that again is cooling the economy down. Obviously, people who work part-time generally making less than people who work full-time, which again means they're going to be more careful about their spending, which puts pressure on businesses to reduce inflation.
Yeah, so more than 65,000 jobs were lost during the month of December, and the participation rate fell from the previous month as well. So what's behind those changes?
Yeah, so the 65,000 fall, I think that's a bit of a reversion from very, very strong gains in October and November. When we take the quarterly number, we've seen around 50,000 jobs or 50,000 extra people working in Australia compared to September. So it's not that a bunch of jobs were lost necessarily. I mean, they were in the month. When we look a bit longer term, it's just that the pace of those gains is getting slower. We also know that things like the referendum meant that jobs were quite temporary in certain circumstances in Q4. And then we also had some sample changes in the data, which can create bigger changes than usual. But as the Australian Bureau of Statistics said, and as I expect the Reserve Bank to highlight, it's still a very, very low unemployment rate. And there is still a long way to go until the unemployment rate becomes a concern. We really don't think it's going to start with a 4 until about mid next year. And we have to remember that between 1975 and 2021, it only got under 4% for 1 month. So this is still a very, very tight labour market.
Yeah, and Adelaide, what does it mean for the economy and outlook for interest rates?
The fall in employment and the shift towards part-time work, which I think is probably, to me at least, the more important part of this data, this tells us that the average household is going to have a little bit less income, or there is going to be a higher share of our households who are thinking more carefully about their money. Now, that is something that hits the economy in a big way. The Reserve Bank, by pushing interest rates higher, is trying to slow the economy down. And when people are more likely to be working part-time or thinking more carefully about their spending, that's going to be slowing both economic activity and inflation down. If you're turning around from the coffee shop who's asking for $6 for a coffee and going, you know what, I can't do it, they're going to have to think much more carefully about how they raise their prices. That's just one example. And you can see that flowing through the economy in the inflation data as well. I think overall, this is good news for the Reserve Bank, and of course, bad news for those 65,000 people in December who went from having a job to becoming unemployed.
Yeah, absolutely. Many people are very anxious about their finances now into the new year. Where do you think the jobless rate is going in 2024?
We expect the unemployment rate to stay really pretty low through 2024, but to continue to drift upwards. By the middle of the year, we think the unemployment rate will be around 4%. And by the end of the year, we think that the unemployment rate will be in the low 4s, so around 4.2%. Again, much lower than what we saw before COVID, but rising steadily. Now, part of the reason for that is that population growth in Australia is very, very strong at the moment, and the amount of people who live here is growing faster than the amount of people who can get jobs here. Now, that's not the fault of anyone moving in or moving out, of course. It's just one of those economic circumstances that we happen to be in. It's really more about the change in the economy due to higher interest rates and inflation. So we do expect the labour market to continue to loosen. Other leading indicators show this as well. So the ANZ Indeed job ads data has been coming down from its peak since 2022. ABS job vacancies are also down from their peak. So it's not just that fewer people were employed in December. It's not just 1 month of data. We're seeing that the number of employers who are actually advertising jobs is coming down as well. But again, it's coming down from a really strong point. We are not looking at this data going, oh, there's high unemployment, no one can get a job. What we're saying is it's weaker than the strongest point in 50, 60 years. So it's coming down from this super, super hot point. It's still actually a really good time in the labour market. And when we look long term, this is still a time where there are more jobs available, there are fewer people unemployed, and there are more people participating in the workforce than there have been in the last 10, 20, 30 years.
Now, the global outlook for rate cuts has evolved pretty quickly. The hawkish commentary from both European Central Bank and the US Fed officials earlier this week has sort of dampened hopes on rate cuts overseas. What about here in Australia? When can we expect the RBA to cut rates?
We at ANZ Research forecast that the Reserve Bank's first rate cut will be in Q4 of this year, so around November 2024. Now, we actually have always thought that the Reserve Bank would cut later than other central banks. And that's because we have a lot more debt here. We have a lot more variable debt. We're not like the USA, who everybody's on a 30-year fixed rate for their mortgage. And so the Reserve Bank, they can't go up as high. So instead of going hike, 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 cut, 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 they hike a little less, but they stay at the top a little longer. The longer we see other central banks stay at their peaks or not cut, the longer we might think that the Reserve Bank will also stay up. But just because another central bank starts to cut rates doesn't mean we'll see that as straight away in Australia. Though central bank tightening hawkish bias has not changed our view on the Reserve Bank, though. The Reserve Bank is looking more inward at the moment to domestic demand pressures. A lot of our inflation from global factors has actually come down quite nicely. And the big problem is domestic demand in Australia, which means there are cohorts of people out there who are still able to afford those price increases. And that means that there are some businesses out there that are still feeling empowered to push any cost increases into prices. Because of course, just because your cost of business goes up doesn't mean your prices go up. Sometimes it means your profit margins go down. And that's what the Reserve Bank will need to see for inflation to come back to 3%. We think by the second half of this year, quarter on quarter inflation will be showing an annualized rate of 3%, which means it'll be getting to the right speed, but it has to be at the right speed for a whole year for that headline number to be in that good 2 to 3% range.
ANZ Senior Economist Adelaide Timbrell, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.